Hey, can people hear what I'm saying? Ironically, I'm not very good at handling this technology. Or paradoxically. Oh, I see that there are 3 people connected, therefore I can start. Hooray! Okay, so. Oh, but why can I hear myself? Odd. Technical issues. Does anyone know what to do when you hear yourself echoing? Okay. I'll just start talking and I hope everything would be fine. Okay, so welcome everyone to this lecture about debating technology. I'll start with a quick introduction about what we're going to talk about, what we're not going to talk about, and what is expected. So, first of all, notice that there is an outline to this lecture which is attached. Therefore, you can know what we're talking about at each moment. So, even if you zone out, at least you know. Uh, wait, but this echo is killing me. Really sorry. Um. Okay, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? So, can people hear me now? It seems like I have fixed the problem on my end at least. Okay, cool. So, this topic is obviously huge. Therefore, on the one hand, I am going to have a lot to talk about. On the other hand, I won't be able to cover everything. So, if you have questions, please feel free to ask if you want in this platform or if you get to see me in some sort of debate event. Obviously, I'll be very happy to chat about this. A quick word about what is not going to be in this lecture. We are going to talk about technology, about different examples of motions, different facts, different theories that have to do with debating technology. However, I'm not going to address motions that start with given the technology something that are not relevant to the technology itself. So motions like given the technology, this house as a genius would lower its IQ is a great motion. However, this has little to do with the specific technology. The word technology is mentioned just so we could debate the topic at hand. Therefore, this is not something that I'm going to address. I'm going to address things that have to do with technologies, whether they are low tech, things like radio, things like the telegraph back in the day, things like railroads, and whether it is high tech, everything that has to do with the digital world, etc. So, the first topic we're going to talk about is metaphors. The reason I decided to start my lecture with metaphors is because I think that as debaters, metaphors is something that is extremely helpful to us and something that I recommend that everyone uses in their debate. And what do I mean by that? When we refer to technology, often our way of arguing about it, what we should do about it, how we should look at it, whether it is good or bad, is done through the use of metaphors because they are the ones to spark our imagination and our understanding by associating a piece of technology which we may or may not know with something else that we do know. And notice that we keep on using that even in daily life. So, for example, when we talk about the web, some people say that the web is like their home. They see it as their own private sphere where they want to surf and realize certain truths and be anonymized and as safe as they are at home. While other people see it as the new town square, where people meet each other and experience new things and engage and discuss different topics. And the metaphor that we choose is extremely important when we want to persuade someone of something. So, especially in debating, I would suggest that you carefully choose the metaphor that you use and run with that metaphor in order to explain to the judges why you think that you are correct. But also notice what is the metaphor that the other side is using and try to see whether you agree with that. And if you don't agree with it, why? Why do you think that the metaphor is not analogous to what we're talking about? So, just a few more examples of interesting metaphors that I think people can use. So, for example, when we talk once again about the internet, notice that we can talk about the internet as a tool. Therefore, we assume some sort of properties to it or a property right to the internet. We can talk about the internet as a place. And then there is the question of who owns the place. So, for example, does Facebook own Facebook, or at least does it get to decide on all of the rules? Or is this some sort of public space where we also get a say, and so on? Another metaphor that is interesting is when it comes to different abilities that technology gives us. One might say that we are losing our ability, for example, to remember by using our smartphones constantly. But a different metaphor could be that we are outsourcing our abilities. Now, when we use outsourcing, it sounds much more positive because that way we are explaining that actually we are freeing ourselves to do other things while we allow the technology to do something that the technology does much better than our human brains. And another metaphor that is interesting is about net neutrality. When discussing the idea of net neutrality and whether we should allow different internet providers to set different prices for different internet usage, meaning that an internet provider could potentially take more money if we want to use sites that are very heavy in streaming, or take less money if we only use certain sites but not other sites. We can look at the internet as some sort of infrastructure, just like electricity or like phones. And if we use this metaphor, it doesn't seem very fair that net neutrality is not observed, because it would seem ridiculous that someone who provides electricity to us would say, "Oh, Monica, you want to use your charger, but I don't like that you should only use your washing machine." We wouldn't say that. We would obviously say that we have a right to use electricity in whichever way that we want and just to pay a certain amount for the usage of it. So we would use this metaphor if we are against net neutrality. But if we are for net neutrality, maybe we would like to use a metaphor like cable TV. No one on TV owes us anything when it comes to what kind of channels we get. Obviously, we can go to a different cable provider and they would give us different channels. And if we really, really like TV, we would pay a lot. And if we don't really like TV and just want to have the basic channels, we would pay less for it and we would think that it's fair. So this is a metaphor that we can use. The only question then becomes what is relevant to the technology. And in order to do that, we need to understand the technology itself and how it works, and then choose the right metaphor for it. So that was on that, and we'll see that those metaphors are going to continue on serving us along this lecture. Now, let's move on to the next chapters of this lectures. And these chapters have to do with the different stages of the life of technology. So we're going to start with the development of technology, then we're going to discuss a bit the implementation of it, then the uses of it, starting from an individual level and then moving on to societal uses and other implications that have to do with morality and so on, and ending with regulation. So, on development of technology. So, the first thing to remember about the development of technology that first of all it is need based, meaning that we need to understand and remember that technology is a tool. It is something that we do when there is a certain need. And this means that there isn't technology that is developed just because, or at least we wouldn't hear about such technologies because they wouldn't be successful. So I would suggest again saying that technology is silly or there is no one who wants it. However, notice that this need is not necessarily a universal need, meaning that those who invented the technology or those that see the need that the technology actually solves are not always everyone, and they might have different interests. So, just to give you a few very different examples of need based technology and what they tried to solve. So, the radio was actually invented not for the purposes of entertainment, but as a way of fixing the telegraph, because the telegraph could not reach the sea. And there was a lack of opportunity for different ships to communicate messages to the mainland. So Marconi invented this because he saw a potential market in the Navy that would buy it from him. Later on, it became something that provided other needs that came along. But this was a very specific niche that was solved. Another interesting example that is pretty relevant and might come up in a debate is the dating application. So Bumble is actually an app that is supposed to meet a feminist need that is not resolved in Tinder. So because of the asymmetry of power that is happening on Tinder and because of a lot of sexism that a former employee of Tinder encountered, she then decided to create Bumble as a way of empowering women in dating apps. So she developed this specific technology. There are things that also answer a much broader societal need. So we can say that applications such as Uber and Airbnb and Eat With is something that answers a need for people to get, on the one hand, cheaper services instead of the traditional ones when they are willing to compromise the quality of it, or at least to have a bit more of a risk factor. And on the other hand, a need for many people to supplement their incomes, what we know as the gig economy. So there was a need for certain people to have the ability to use their free time to make money on the side. Now, you can say that there are many issues with that. You can say that there are many problems that have to do with regulation. You can say that eventually, since many people have entered those services as the service providers, this is something that have caused the gig economy to become a regular economy but that pays less, and therefore it is now something that is very harmful. But at least we need to understand that in the historic context there was enough of a need in order to create this technology. So what we would like to discuss is the normative value of it, but not necessarily whether it is something that people historically needed before. The last example that I want to use is the Industrial Revolution, because as many Marxists would say, the history before that seemed very romantic, that there were these personal relationships between people, and the people working in the cottages used to be very happy with the work that they provided and with the relationship they had with their suppliers and so on. But do notice that there were several needs that were unfulfilled before the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, there was a huge problem with merchants getting a reliable supply of the goods that they needed because they tended to rely on people that created those things just as a supplement in their free time. Usually, they were farmers or they were workers that were not professional enough. And those had a lot of power. So if they decided not to do a good job, or if they decided that they now need to tend to their farm, or they don't really want to do something, the merchant would be stuck without the ability to get the goods that he needs and to sell them on, even though he's made certain commitments. So there was a need for merchants to actually centralize the production in their hands and make sure it is reliable enough. Therefore, they had to take it out of the hands of people and move it on to machines, or at least to something that is reliable enough, and also to pay less to those people that they are dependent upon. So you can say that in this aspect, it is not that the economy before was so great, there was actually a dire need for at least a certain group of people to change the economical system as a whole. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is extremely important for analyzing the development of technology is that there is a triangle of three different actors that we can say are involved with the creation of new technology, which is science, entrepreneurs, and the state. And I don't think only one of them is responsible for development of new technology. So science obviously has a lot to do with new development because of new theories, because of universities getting subsidies, and also in these days enjoying certain patents of their work and enjoying prestige that they have as a university that would attract more people to them, and so on. But notice that sometimes it is not enough. Sometimes you have researchers in university that do research for the sake of pure research. Therefore, they don't necessarily have economical aspirations. And here we can see that best in the example of the radio. So, the ideas behind radio waves were known for quite a long time before the invention of the radio itself in 1900. But it took Marconi, who was a businessman, a son of business people, to decide on actually taking these ideas and implementing them into a machine that he would be able to sell for a profit. So here we have the entrepreneurs as a layer of society that is needed in order for the creation and the mass production of technology, or at least handing that to people in a way that would be useful for them. And those entrepreneurs don't have to be educated. Actually, most of them these days are not necessarily, if you look at them, but they do need the profit as a motive for them to continue and deliver those technologies. And that is important to notice is the idea behind patents. Because there is often in debates the question of, okay, so would we still have different inventions if it weren't for patents? And I do think that patents have a lot with the drive that makes people carry on with the hard labor that is necessary not only to have a good idea, but to actually bring it to the market. And if people know that they have at least a few years where they can enjoy the profits of this new technology, it is a huge drive for such a change. So that is on that. Also, we have the state. And the state is a factor that can help and motivate different inventions, but the state is also an inventor of such things, or at least a large contributor that is not or is outside of the free market. So let's start with how the state could help. And this is something that we're going to later on use when we talk about regulations and monopolies and so on. So, first of all, the state decides on the rules. So, I mentioned rules of patents. The state is in charge of that and is in charge of enforcing those. In countries where there are no such rules, we might see that there are less entrepreneurs that come from the market itself. The second thing is the ease of doing business. So people tend to forget that there is a lot of bureaucracy that has to do with starting your own company. And usually in countries where there is less bureaucracy and it is easier, you would see more entrepreneurs as a whole. And this is something that is definitely in the ability of the state to control. Also, we have taxation. Many countries encourage different startups or different companies by giving them lower taxation or by even competing with one another on who's going to get more benefits for the entrepreneurs and the companies themselves. Notice that this isn't always for the benefit of the state, meaning that one can say that there is some sort of race to the bottom where there where there are benefits, but they are excessive because each country doesn't want other countries to have those businesses. But this is something that indeed states control. And the last thing that states do to help when it comes to the development of technology is the level of education that people have. So many people tend to forget that in order to have technologies, you need a lot of people that are knowledgeable, that have a degree of education or some sort of scientific orientation, or at least an ability to tap into the existing knowledge in order to make new tools out of them. And here, countries that do invest a lot in their people are those that tend to enjoy different tech companies coming to them or see a lot of entrepreneurs in them. So, this is something that we see even when it comes to the Industrial Revolution. So, some theories say that it happened specifically in England because there were a lot of people that were literate and educated enough in order to enter this new technological race and have the ability to compete among themselves on who has the better technology. So, that's on what a state can do to encourage. Also, there are technological projects that happened only due to state involvement. And here, the state was the one to initiate them. And we see this most often in the industry that would always get as much money as needed from the state and can only get such amounts of money from the state because no other body would actually give that much money to, and that is the military. So the military is a huge hub for creating innovation just because countries need it for weapons. So, one of the most famous examples that we can think about is actually the internet. The internet was developed as a military project. The computer was also developed as a military project. Now, later on, it became something that academics started to play with, started to develop on the basis of, and took it to their own needs, but only the government could invest so much money into such a project and to start it from zero. So if people try to tell you in a debate that only the free market can come up with new innovations, tell them that they are absolutely wrong and that the government is also capable of that. But the government needs to have the motivation to do that, meaning that it needs to see some sort of value in order for it to put money into it. Another example is not only the military industrial complex, but also the research into space. So the research into space also created a lot of innovations that don't really have to do with space, such as the microwave. So this is another example of why this could be a good thing. And I'd also use this as an example if you want to talk about space exploration and what are the benefits of that don't directly have to do with exploring new planets, but definitely have to do with the way we go about to explore them. So this is something that you can use. The last thing I'm going to say about innovation is that I think it's often ignored that different technologies are also influenced by ideologies of their developers. And I think it's important to see that technologies don't always come as a tabula rasa that we, the users, project our fantasies upon, but also the creators of technology have their own fantasies and even a coherent worldview that they want to shape through that new technology. And if we are able to understand what that ideology is, I think it would be easier for us to later on analyze how people are going to use that technology. So, the best example I can think about is the idea of the internet. So many people tend to describe the internet, at least in its early days when it started, as a sort of frontier or Wild West that has no rules. But actually, it started as an ideology. So it is not that the internet didn't have rules because it didn't have rules. It was because there was an ideology of, I'd even say, anarchical libertarianism that many people that designed the internet had. They envisioned this as a place that would have no barriers that the real world has in order to create better collaboration and to allow free transformation and the free movement of information. So you need to understand that for those academics that have started the internet, there was something revolutionary in the idea that they can use the cyberspace, as they called it, in order to have a non hierarchical way of sharing information amongst themselves and having a free discussion that no one can censor and has no strict rules. And they even started seeing that this brings to more utility because that way they could enjoy more knowledge and more creation based on that. So that was a main ideology that drove the internet. Now, later on, as we know, this ideology did change when the people using the internet started changing. So we saw a migration of people that are not academics. We saw that this became a less homogenous place. We saw that many people started abusing the fact that there are no rules, aka trolls, and so on. But do you notice that there was an ideology? And I think that if we want to stand on the side of not changing the way a certain technology works, it might be beneficial for us to try and tap into what is the ideology behind that. Another example of an ideology is Twitter. So, Twitter started as a place where there is an absolute freedom of speech. And they wanted to maintain this even when users starting protesting against that because they saw this as a unique feature of the technology that they are providing to people and a benefit to it, even though there are some abuses of the system. And that's why we see it handling the way it does. And when we want to analyze it and say that it might be a good thing, we might want to try and figure out what are the benefits of having this one unique platform to operate this way and not in other ways that maybe certain users would like to have. A last example of this is Facebook. So if you got to read about their latest memo, that was run through the company, it actually reveals a lot of the ideology behind Facebook. So Facebook sees the world as a world of connectivity. It wants to allow people to connect to as many other individuals as possible. And whatever stands in this way of connectivity is something that obviously the company does not want to have. And that is why they are even willing to pay the price of assisting terrorists by not deleting their groups or not banning them, or allowing certain features of hate speech, and so on. Now, we can discuss whether the ideology is good or bad, but this ideology is something that we can definitely use. Now, next thing is the implementation. So, here I'm sure many of you know about the graph of marketing and how the technology is usually implemented. So, usually we know that with every new technology, there are those few that are really innovators and are willing to adopt the technology, but actually, what the technology needs in order to succeed is a critical mass. So it needs to reach at least 34% out of the entire population, which would be the early majority. The moment they do this, then they are able to later on get with the majority of people, and so on. So, this is something that is important for us to understand simply for the reason of how usually prices are affected by this. This means usually that every technology that is new would start with a high price, especially if it's not something that comes out of a huge corporation that has a lot of money in order to sell this cheaply. Then there are those people that are willing to buy it for the high cost because it's something cool, it's something that they need. And later on, when more people are willing to come along, then the people manufacturing this technology can lower the prices and more people can enjoy this. This is especially important for debates when you have teams saying that, oh, this is such a huge problem because only the rich could buy this new technology. Well, notice that this is true at first, but it's not necessarily the case that only the rich could enjoy the benefits of such a technology. So, when you hear this, try and think whether it is very likely to become a mass consumed product or not, and if it will, then probably the prices would go down. So, this is relevant, for example, for uh, different genetic manipulations and customized babies and so on, to ask the question of, do you think that this would only be something that the rich would do or something that everyone would do? And if one way or the other, whether it is good or bad. The second thing that I want to mention that is interesting about implementation is that often we think that the moment a new technology arrives to the world, then people just start buying that, and we can know whether it's successful or not according to the number of people that buy it. But many people tend to forget that with some technologies, the implementation itself is something that can kill the technology. And sometimes it's not enough that even many people want to use the technology because the implementation is a process. So here I refer to the example of electricity. Electricity is something that can only be used if you have a network and an infrastructure which is backed up by the state. If the state is not willing to put all the necessary infrastructure, which means all the different cables, and to allow the maintenance of electricity so that it could arrive to each house that wants to, probably we wouldn't have electricity. And it doesn't matter if I want electricity and someone that lives next to me wants electricity, because this is something that lives on a grid. And here, this is something that we need to take into consideration. First of all, when we want to talk about whether some sort of technology would catch on. So, for example, electrical cars are not doing very well at the moment because countries are not willing to invest in them enough and to have the necessary infrastructure in order to have enough stations where everyone can charge their car. Same thing goes to cars that are fueled by gas. This is once again something that needs the grid in order to exist. And if it won't, it doesn't matter if it's the best idea in the world and whether it would save a lot of energy, this would not happen. Same thing with reusable energy in different ways, and probably what we're going to see with autonomous cars. So we would at least need to have some sort of large metropolitan that would be willing to back the implementation of such a technology. I had a professor that predicted that this place might be Tokyo and Japan. So if you want to use a place that is open enough for innovation and has enough of a need and enough of a population that can buy it, probably Tokyo is the place that you want to refer to. Also, this helps us explain why many developing nations have a problem with allowing people to enjoy the fruits of technology. So it's not necessarily that people don't have the means to buy the technology, but it is that the country is not willing to put the money and the work that is needed in order to have this infrastructure for the technology. So I think here an interesting way of distinguishing it by a counterexample is actually the popularity of smartphones and different alternative solutions to internet that we see in Africa. So many people have their internet provided by their cellular providers, something that they don't need the state to do, but is enough to have different companies in the free market in order to provide to them. And this explains why many of them were able to connect to the internet without the need of the government. But with other things, they do need the government to do that. So this might be something that we could use in further debates. Okay, now moving on to the next idea, which is the technological uses. So I'm going to start with something that I think that is important for any debate about technology and the benefits of technology. Before we can even start talking about what would be the large impacts of such a technology and whether this technology is good or bad, you needed to start with describing what are the unique features of the specific technology you are talking about. Without explaining what the technology consists of, you're going to have a huge problem with saying what you think is good or bad or what would happen. A, because not everyone would agree with you that the technology looks this way. B, because often people would say that the certain problems that you are trying to describe are not unique to the technology itself. They might be just a human desire that is existing outside of the realm of technology, or that this is something that already existed before with other forms of technology and is not unique to the technology we are talking about. So, here my advice would be start with a description of what this technology consists of that is specific, and I would even use the word inherent to try to describe what it is. And here I'd base this on what we know in reality about the technology, what we know about the function of the technology, things that were described to us in the info slide, or if you are opening government, what you decide to define as the features of this technology, or if you are another team in the debate, what opening government decided to say are the features of this technology. So, just to give you an example, if we want to analyze Facebook and talk about the different aspects that it has, I think it could be a good idea to analyze what is the meaning of likes. So, likes is something that you can quantify. You can see exactly how many likes you have. You can compare the number of likes that you got to the number of likes that your friend got, and so on. Now, knowing this, you can explain why it is very likely for people to start measuring themselves according to the number of likes that they got. And they might start seeing the likes as a means of understanding their worth. And it is very likely for them to become quite depressed by the fact that they could never achieve the number of likes that celebrities or other people that are very popular would get. Therefore, even though many of their friends might really enjoy the photos that they share or their statuses and so on, many people would feel that this is not enough or might keep on constantly refreshing just to see whether more people like them or not. Another example is if we want to talk about Twitter, the idea that the following system in Twitter is asymmetrical and is equivalent to a post that to a tweet that you like or you dislike. So this means that I can follow someone without having them following me, meaning that there are certain hubs that have more influence in Twitter, unlike users that are less popular, and also that I tend to share things that I don't necessarily like. Therefore, it is very likely not only for things that in Reddit would be upvoted to become popular, but also things that are irritating. Therefore, this explains researches like the most common feeling in Twitter is people being angry and enraged about different things. And this is something that you can attribute to the different features of that specific technology. So always try and start with that in order to show why you think that something would happen. Here, you can also use things that you think are likely or probable to happen with this technology. So, if we're talking about a technology that we're not sure about yet, for example, autonomous robots in the military, there are certain things that are likely to be features of those robots. So, for example, somebody needs to program them, obviously. Now, you can use this in order to question whether those programmers would have the moral ability to design them well, or whether the people that have oversight on the code have the ability to understand whether those robots would be moral or not. So, if you want to show your generals this new code that you wrote for your robot, do they have the ability to say, I think that this robot is going to make too many accidents or is going to falsely kill people that I don't want? Probably not, because of the way code looks. So you can use this to show that there might be major issues or that there might even be cover ups of codes that are immoral, using the fact that it is written in a language that many people in the military, or at least in the high ranks of the military, do not understand. Also, something that we've used is something that we knew from other technologies. So, many technologies have what we call backdoors, the ability to patch the software and just see the different problems with it. And we use this to claim that the backdoors could be some sort of way for different countries to get access to those robots and maybe try to hack them or try to use them in a way that would be against our desires as a military. So, this is something that obviously you can argue would not happen, but knowing such a feature of technology, you can also use this in order to explain that something good or bad is going to happen because of that. So, that's the first aspect to describe. Another aspect to describe is not only the different features that are inherent, but also describing it through the likely usage by the user of this technology. So here, this is what I call the phenomenology of the technology, meaning who are the likely users of this technology, how do they perceive the technology, how would they feel about the technology, and derive impact from this. So here I have an example of a motion that we had in an Israeli competition. It was about the existence of an alternative reality machine that allows someone to go back to a certain critical junction of a decision that he or she had to make and see what his life could have looked like if he were to choose the other path. And here we were able to use the way that people are going to use this machine in order to show that this would lead to unhappiness among the users. So, first of all, we started with describing who are the likely users of this technology. And here we said that it's very likely that people who are unhappy to begin with their life are going to use this technology, because people that seem happy with their decisions would not want to shake the boat, would not want to take the risk of maybe finding out that there could have been something better, or they are too happy uh, to go and start messing with what could have been. So it is very likely that those who would want to are people that are curious because they feel that there is something missing in their life, that there are doubts that they are having, and they want to see what could have been. This means already that people that are likely to use the machines are a bit pessimistic, and the they're going to start comparing the lives that they have with the alternative, starting from a point where already one scenario seems very bad. The second thing that we use to show that people are going to be unhappy with their current life when they compare themselves to something that they could have had is a feature of the machine, which is that the machine is not showing you a process, it's showing you a glimpse, and it is not showing you the mundane parts of life. Now, this means that when you experience your alternative reality, you're actually experiencing it just like a tourist would experience a new country, meaning that you don't see all the negative sides, but you only see the cool now and here that you get to do in this place. Once again, a metaphor. But we then showed that in real life, you always remember the bad things. So you remember the the different arguments and bickering that you had with your spouse. You remember that you have debts to pay. You remember that you have a lousy job, and so on. Something that you are not going to see because you don't have enough of a duration of time in this machine in order to experience. Therefore, once again, you're always going to be unhappy because you are not able to compare those things on the same level. And you can go on and on with the things that you see and experience in the machine, unlike those that you experience in life. But do notice that those are things that derive specifically from the way the machine works as defined by opening government in the debate. If you are opening government here, you can also define it to be a different way. You can say that you get to see a process. You can say that this machine shows you what are the following steps and what caused what, and maybe different things that happened along the way and the different parts of the equation. You can also say that you just see the outcome without seeing the path. Everything is fine as long as you make sure to define it. And then when you use your analysis, try and use the specific features that we've given. Now, when it comes to phenomenology, there are four ways, according to Don Adey, that we interact with machines and with technology that I think can help you in different types of analysis if you want to be specific, or at least have this organized in front of you. So, the first relationship that we might have with technology is one of embodiment, meaning that the technology becomes a part of our body, becomes a part of us against the world. So, here we can see the example of a walking stick or glasses that people might have. This is something that we don't even notice, it becomes our second eyes. Now, we can say when we want to talk about modern technology that maybe the memory of our phone is something that becomes a part of our brain or something that is a part of our body. Therefore, if we lose it, it is like we lost something that was a part of our body. Also, when we talk about cyborgs and different technology, this is something that is likely to happen. The second type of relationship is what is called a hermeneutic relations. And here, this means that the technology is something that mediates the world to us, meaning that we look at the world differently because of that technology, because it allows us to read the world in a certain way. So, here a modern example could be a GPS application like Waze. We get to see the world through Waze and the way it perceives roads and what it tells us to do, and so on. We don't look at the road the same way. Another example is Google Glass or virtual reality, where we might have different messages popping up in front of us and mediating the world to us. So maybe we would have a conversation with someone and there would be a reminder, this is this person's birthday, and then we read the situation in a different way. Maybe we understand why this person is mad at us for not congratulating him, and so on. Or maybe having different interpretations of things that we see around us. So this is something that affects the relationship that we have, and we can use that for analysis. Third type of interaction is alterity, meaning that we see the technology as something that is estranged to us, something that is not a part of us, that stands alone in the world and has its own life. Here, I think the most prominent example is people shouting at their computer for not functioning well, as if it has a life and a will of its own. Why do you decide to shut down? What's wrong with you? People kicking their technology and so on, just because they see it as this something else in their life. Here, I think this could be especially relevant when we talk about technologies such as robots or different toys that seem humanoid or seem like it is something else. And this is probably a good basis for any type of analysis that we want to do of whether this thing has rights or whether this has meaning of its own, or whether treating this piece of technology in a poor manner is something that is likely to cause us to be less moral because we see it as a stranger and we actually practice being disrespectful towards someone else. So a bit like the equivalent of saying that those who tend to be cruel to animals will also be cruel to human beings. So we can say that those that tend to be cruel to technology that is seen as another to us could become cruel to other human beings, and so on. The last type of relations that we might have with technology is what we call background relations. And this refers to the idea that this technology is something that we don't even notice in our daily lives. It just becomes something that is a part of the scenery. So, for example, I don't think anyone really notices the different noises that their refrigerator makes. It's just a part of life. Or if an airplane goes up in the sky, probably no one would pay attention to the sound that it makes. I think here an interesting usage of this could be when it comes to different technology of surveillance. So things like CCTV and so on. People tend to really get used to quickly to surveillance technology because it's something that is in the background, it's something that they don't feel, and people have more urgent needs when it comes to their daily life rather than thinking about what would people see if they look at me through the camera every second. I think a good example for that is in shows like The Big Brother, reality shows, where people quickly forget that there is a camera and start doing things that most of us, and probably them, would be ashamed of for doing. And this is especially interesting because there is a lot of this technology around us. And if we want to talk about issues like privacy, or if we want to talk about why maybe it's a good thing and why maybe people don't even care about those things, we can use such a relation between that. I could say that I use this in the debate about the Archangel technology from Black Mirror to explain why it is very likely that kids would not be bothered by the existence of the Archangel chip in their brain. Now, you could also say that it's a problem, but at least we use this in the debate to say that this might be a good thing. So that is about that. The last thing that I would try and address, if you want to talk about things that are specific to the technology that do not exist in other means, is probably the business model behind the technology, or what do the people controlling or inventing the technology want. And this is the ideology that I referred to before, but also a more practical practice that those people actually do. So, for example, I would use the advertisement model that many social media platforms have as a means of explaining why there are certain issues that arise specifically in those technologies. So, for example, there is the case that there is an inherent need for Facebook and Instagram and so on to collect as much information on us, even though they might have good intentions, because they are dependent on advertisers. And they can't really know in advance what kind of information advertisers would want, because there are many advertisers and they don't want to block off potential revenues for them, or potential means to gain interest from advertisers. Therefore, they need to get as much information as possible. Also, because they study what makes people more addicted and what makes people buy more things, this means that they need to get as much information, because sometimes this is dependent simply on correlation. Sometimes you can understand that a person would like a specific product just because he votes for a specific party. Now, this seems to have no connection whatsoever, but apparently the data can reflect such a thing, meaning that it is within the business model that they need to have this huge database when it comes to everything that we do, even if those things don't necessarily have to do with the technology itself. Same thing about causing us to be addicted. They have the ability to actually see the way we react according to each change that they make. So if they change the font, or if they change something in the videos, they can see immediately what we like more and less. I would refer you to an anecdotal example, but I think it's very interesting to see. If you know the Facebook group Tasty that shows you videos of recipes, notice that they change the style of the recipes that they show constantly in order to check what brings more clicks. So the new trend that they have now is not to show you the food when it's done, but to show you a piece of the process, then go back to the beginning, and only then show you how it's done till the end. So in time, we'll see if it works or not, but this is their new gimmick, if you want. So this is something that I would use to analyze. Now, as I said, you need to be as specific as possible, but notice that if you want to challenge what a team says that is likely to happen with the technology, you can try and show that this is not inherent to the technology, and that this is a human desire that exists irrespectively. And here you need to try and come up with a few examples where you can actually see this behavior occurring, or other technologies or other areas where this is happening. So, a cute example for that is that there is a very famous picture of people sitting on a train somewhere in Europe, and you can see that everyone sits with their newspapers in front of them, and no one is engaged in any conversation. I think it's a cute way of showing that it's not that people are necessarily more disconnected from each other today when they have smartphones. It might be a human desire to have your own space and not to want to interact with strangers when you are in a public place. So you can say that at least it's not the technology that harms this need to disconnect and connect to only those that you want at the same time. Uh, Here, I think an interesting example for a debate where you might want to argue a lot about whether something is inherent to the technology or not is a debate that we had about an app that allows you to rank different people according to your interaction with them. So sort of Uber for friends or generally people. And here, if you are on the side that this app is bad, you want to show what are the specific features of this app that would cause you to be less moral to others or would cause you to rate people in a way that would harm them. Or you might want to show that the app does not change a lot. So you can say that people that are racist would continue on doing racist things. You can say that people that are nice would rank you in a way that you would see fair, and so on. And here you can really play with what you think about the human nature and what you think would change in that human nature before or after the technology. So this is something that I definitely use. Last thing about technological use is about definitions. So here, actually, I had people asking me what is the right thing to define if you're opening government and what you can't define. So, first of all, I think that it is something that I would recommend for opening governments to start with a definition of the technology. And here, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a mechanism. I'd say that it's a description of what is probable. The mechanism applies to things that are left in as a question mark. So, for example, if we have this alternative reality machine, I would definitely explain as part of the mechanism whether I'm going to see a glimpse, whether I'm going to see the entire process, how much time people would have in the machine, and so on. I think this is something that is important for everyone to debate on the same level. So this is something that opening government needs to define. Other aspects are something that I would just recommend. So if you have a motion like this house regrets Twitter, obviously you don't need to define Twitter, but it would help if you describe that. So try and see. Mechanism is only relevant if this is a new technology that no one knows of, and it would be the technical question of how this would work. Now, something that some teams do, and I think is not exactly legitimate in the debate, is to try and define how people would use this technology. And here, I don't think OG has a monopoly of how people would use the technology once it exists. I think it's good to describe what is the likely usage, but opposition can definitely say that there are likely to be other forms of using this technology. So, for example, opening government could say in the debate about the Archangel chip, it's the chip that you put in your kid's brain in order to measure different parameters that have to do with their health in order to see what they see and so on. So OG can say that it is very likely that parents would use this in a responsible way, considering that they like their kids and that we can introduce different programs to educate parents on responsible uses of this technology. However, opposition can come and say that while many parents do have good intentions, many of them still are human beings that are very curious and are even paranoid when it comes to their children. Therefore, even though they might even promise their kid that they are only going to use this if there are signs of trouble, they are going to watch this constantly, or they are going to use this when they are bored, they are going to use this when there is something about the kid's life that they morally disapprove of, and so on. So here, this is something that each team needs to define and needs to show, moreover, why this is comparatively more plausible than the other scenario of use. Last thing that I would say about this is about motions that are set from an actor's perspective. So if we have the motion this house as a parent would use Archangel or would not use archangel, something that teams do from opening government is say, well, obviously we are the parent, therefore we are going to use it in a smart way. We're not going to do stupid things. I think you can say that, but you need to explain why it's plausible. Because it is likely to assume that even though you are debating this as a parent, you need to debate this as the average parent, not the specific parent that you might be. So here, if someone does that in OG, I think OO has every right to say that OG cannot just make out uses that they don't like of the technology. I think this is also a good advice for CAs. Maybe try and avoid such motions that are set from an external perspective where the team can just say, well, we would use it in the best way possible, and maybe try and talk about the technology as a whole. So this house prefers a world where parents use it, or this house believes that parents should use such a thing. And of course, if you are not sure about the mechanism, if you are not sure about how the technology works or what you can and can't define, obviously go and ask the A team. I'm sure that they have all the right answers to that, and that way at least you know what is defined in the motion and what is not defined in the motion. So that is about the usage. Last thing I want to talk about analyzing the use of technology is the importance of age categories. So here, many times people analyze the users as one homogenic group. And I think a really interesting distinction that also comes up in a lot of debates is the age category. And there is a difference that is also described in sociological theory in the way different generations approach technology. So I'd start with a bit of a funny quote from Douglas Adams. It's a paraphrase, so try and see the real quote for yourself. But he says the following thing: if you are born in a world where a certain technology exists, this is a part of the world for you, and this is a part of the natural order of things that you don't even try and question. If this technology appears when you are at the ages 15 to 35, this is the next best thing that is going to improve the life of humanity, revolutionize the world, and you might even find a job at it. If this technology appears after you are at the age of 35, then this is something that goes against the natural order of things and is a recipe for the decay of society and immorality in it. Now, it might sound funny, but there is an element of truth to it, in the sense that there are different receptions to technology in different ages. And here I'd try and analyze what are those differences and from then try and claim the normative value of why this is good or bad. So, specifically, when we talk about kids and teenagers, the first thing to understand is that unlike grown ups, kids don't have something to compare this technology to. So while grown ups have the ability to compare the world before the technology to the world with the technology, and then have the ability to take only the good things from the technology, but also enjoy things that are outside the world of technology. So, for example, people that have had serious relationships with others, true friendships, and are then introduced to Facebook are likely to enjoy both having the shallow Facebook friendships and still having their true friends that they met at the age of 10, and so on. Kids don't necessarily have that, and they don't even have the ability to try and think whether there is something that they lose by using the technology or using the technology too much. And here you can say that this leads to bad usages of the technology and the lack of ability to prove to them that there might be a problem with using the technology that they like so much. Second thing about kids is that they do have a different cognitive and hormonal stage than adults. This means that they have less of an ability to be critical towards the thing that they see. They are also influenced by their hormones, by their need to impress their peers, by the will to rebel against what society tells them. They tend to become more addicted to things, unlike grown ups, and so on. Third thing is that kids also have different social needs than grown-ups. That's why we can see that kids are more worried about the managing of their own identity and their image in front of others. They want to engage in things that are fun for them and don't want to do things that they must do. Therefore, they are more likely to do things that are escapist, and so on. So this is something that I would use in debates such as uh, this house regrets the substitution of digital entertainment for written materials. So we might want to show what are the unique things that kids do or kids have that make this new form of entertainment something that harms them or something that is good for them, and so on. As I explained, also you want to show the things that are inherent to the technology, or when you have the motion, this house believes it was better growing up in the world before the prevalence of online social media. You might also want to explain here what makes kids um, act in a certain way, unlike grown-ups, and at least you are not committed to certain things that grown-ups do in social media, unlike uh, things that kids do. And the thing to focus here is about growing up with the technology and not just adopting it. So this is something to analyze. Here, there's also the question of responsibility. Considering that there are different users to the technology, there is the question of who is in charge of the way they use it. Is it the responsibility of the kids themselves? Is it the responsibility of parents? Is it the responsibility of the corporations that are in charge of the technology? Obviously, you want to show the thing that is most relevant to the case that you have at hand. So you might want to show that parents are enough in order to mediate the way we use it, or we might want to show that parents cannot really have the ability to understand the technology or persuade their kids due to factors that have to do with the time of the parents or their lack of literacy in the technology, or that they can't handle the different tricks that the corporations do to make us hooked to the technology. Therefore, it cannot be the responsibility of parents, but should be the responsibility of corporates. So, this is something for you to analyze if you want, just to get you the idea of how I think about it. I think that an interesting POI in such a debate could be, why does Facebook ban the use of its platform to kids that are below the age of 13? And the answer that you get reveals a bit on what are the problems that have to do with kids and technology, and you might want to show that they apply to teenagers as well. So, this is something that I would definitely use. Another such thing is the motion from Rotterdam in 2016. This house would ban talk toys. Here, you specifically want to show what are the advantages or disadvantages of a kid growing up with a technology that helps him imitate conversations and so on, whether it is mutually exclusive to other conversations that he might have. What are the drawbacks of such a technology, and can it emulate enough the way human beings interact, and so on? Would it be as engaging for a kid, or would the kid just leave it after a few days, and so on? So, these are things for you to think about. Now, obviously, about everything that I just said, it's really good to read about the technologies themselves. So I cannot cover everything that is relevant, but do try to at least understand a bit about the features of the technologies that we use, especially those that we use online, things like Facebook and so on. I predict that there's going to be at least one Cambridge Analytica motion coming up soon. So you might want to know what is Cambridge Analytica, what they did, and what Facebook did that helped them thrive in such a way that they did. So that was about that part. And now, if you notice in the outline of the lecture, we are moving on to the social impacts of technology. So here I want to start with a bit of discussion about morality and technology. So when we talk about morality, I think there is an interesting question of whether technology changes morality or reflects the current morality of society. Now, in real life, the answer is probably both. But in a debate, usually it is your task to show what is the chicken and what is the egg. And you want to try and analyze what existed before and is influenced by the technology, or what the technology changes. Eh, and here, I think there are interesting examples where we get to ask those questions of whether this is something that technology enhances or not. So, the autocomplete feature in Google is definitely something that reflects a lot of negative moral aspects of society. So, for example, this is a real research. A study in the United States found that parents tend to look for the following when it comes to their sons. Is my son genius or is my son gifted are the number one searches. But when it comes to their daughters, the first searches that they do is my daughter overweight? And the second one, is my daughter ugly? And this is definitely something that reflects a bias towards girls that does not exist towards boys. And there is a question here: if I get to see that in Google when I do my autocomplete, does this reinforce and normalize this different aspect of morality? And if this is the case, is it something that should change? Or, on the contrary, should we see Google as a neutral platform that only reflects to us something that we need to know about the society that we live in? Therefore, it is an educational tool for us when it comes to being a moral agent and so on. Another example of technologies that reflect morality and could potentially change it that are not from the internet is prenatal examinations. So, this is a sort of technology that is very useful to see whether your newborn is going to suffer from diseases, but it did bring new moral questions that did not exist before on miscarriages and whether you should miscarriage fetus if it has certain problems. So, for example, now a very hot debate is whether Down syndrome is something that you should have a miscarriage for, or maybe it's not a worthy reason to miscarry a child. So, this is an example for a dilemma that didn't exist before the technology. Therefore, it is new, but it has to do with the realm of morality that the technology just enabled to do. Another one of those debates that I think is very interesting is the development of humanoid learning sex bots that brings a very interesting debate about how we see people, about objectification, about the nature of relationships, and so on. And most of the discussion there is probably going to be about ethics and morality and how the specific technology changes it. But do remember that you need to show what prematures what when you analyze that. Another thing that is interesting and people often avoid is that while there might be moral setbacks when it comes to technology, people also evolve morally with their technology. So, obviously, at the beginning, there is a phase of trying to figure out what is the moral thing to do. And for that, people need to see the different impacts that the technology has on society before they even do things. But there are many changes that are for the better that have to do with the gradual implementation of technology. So, for example, we can even see it with social networks that now there are more and more people that understand that there might be a problem with overusage of social networks or their phones and so on. And there are starting to be solutions for that. So people try to limit themselves, to limit their kids. Um, there is now the Delete Facebook campaign that is a response to a moral issue with privacy when it comes to Facebook. And there are also technological solutions to those problems. So, for example, there are apps that don't allow you to access your phone when you're working, as a way of solving a certain problem that the technology existed. Another example that I think is interesting, that is a bit from a different realm, is when it comes to streaming music and pirate downloads. So when Napster began and the idea of peer to peer sharing and moving music from one computer to another without paying for it, obviously it created a huge problem where the people creating the music did not get enough money. However, we see that there was a development of the solution of this problem. And we might even say that the solution is better than the situation before the problem rose. So, first, there were lawsuits against users, which turned out to be very ineffective. And later on, there was the realization that there might be something that is highly damaged with the way the music industry works, meaning that it might be that CDs are overcharging people and that label records is something that belongs to the past. And we saw this with the rise of the different streaming services that do allow artists to still get money, but also for users to pay less, which is something that more people are willing to do and is linked to less piracy over the years. So I think this is another example of why something that started off as really problematic and even created a moral panic eventually is solvable. But we just need to give it time, and there is a solution that has to do with a new way of thinking about morality and technology and so on. Now, where could this be relevant? So, obviously, whenever we talk about different problems with technology, if we can explain that this is something solvable and this is just something that takes time, but there are means to do it, then obviously we can show that the problems are not that big. I think it's also used in a very interesting way in the prime directive debate, which is the debate from Star Trek that says that if you encounter different alien species that are less developed technologically than you are, should you just leave them alone and not contact them, or should you share your technology with them and help them? So someone who is against the prime directive might or is for the prime directive might say that because technology involves a certain moral development to go along with it, it would be immoral to just give it away as it is to a people that did not undergo this entire process of understanding what could be the problems with the usage of the technology, how to avoid them, and so on. And if you just give it to them, they might start doing things that are silly, but they just don't know what the consequences are, and those consequences could be deadly. So, for example, if we give them technology that might be used for weaponry, those aliens that do not have the history of our world wars or our knowledge of why violence is bad could use it to make guns and just start slaughtering one another because they didn't go through this moral development of the technology. Now, if you want to be on the side against and you want to show maybe why this is not something that is such an issue, I think there's a cool metaphor, as we've mentioned, that one could use. And this is the metaphor of Wakanda. So, if you watch Black Panther and you know that Wakanda is highly developed technologically but does not share its technology with others, if and when they decide to give this technology to others, I don't think anyone would suspect them of doing things that are evil with the technology or becoming colonialist with it. So you might want to use this to show why giving technology is not necessarily something that would cause the abuse of that technology if we just give it away. So that's food for thought on that. Last question about morality is, as I said, who has a moral responsibility for the use of technology, and specifically, do the owners of corporations that own technologies have a moral duty for the use of their technology? And here this arises in several debates. So, for example, about the debate of whether Google should report searches that have to do with suicide, there is the question of, does Google have this obligation? And here you can discuss whether the ability means that you need to help. So you can try and analyze this like the ability to save a drowning kid. If you are the only person that sees a kid drowning, you must do something to help them, and maybe Google should do the same. Or you can say that they don't have this responsibility because they are just the provider of information, and that this has other bad implications, and so on, or that maybe they don't have the ability to accurately help or do what is necessary in order to prevent suicides. Another debate that could arise and is debated right now in Google is whether they should give you medical advice based on your searches. So if you search something and it's correlated with having a certain disease, should it tell you to go and examine yourself? And there is a real question, because on the one hand it might help you, especially when it comes to early diagnosis. This is something that could potentially save your life. On the other hand, it is quite creepy that they have medical knowledge of me, and this knowledge might go to other bodies that would use this knowledge maybe against me, or maybe to raise the price of a certain drug that I might want to use, and so on. More issues like that is, as I mentioned, with the search algorithms. Should they be changed or not? This is a debate that was, I think, in Riga Open. Issues about sabotaging of dictatorial regimes. Should companies like Google cooperate with the Chinese government or the Turkish government, or should they sabotage them? Should places like Facebook try and go against the, back in the day, Trump campaign, or right now, whoever's campaign you want to sabotage? So these are questions that need to be answered, and I think there are many interesting ways to think about it. Now, this leads me to the idea of technology and rights. Or at least I think that this is a very helpful framework if you want to use for moral debates. So here it's important to notice that you can look at every technology or the use of it from a utilitarian or consequential perspective, meaning that you can just talk about the merits and the drawbacks of a certain technology. But I think there is value of taking your arguments to the platform of rights, and then simply balancing between the rights that are harmed on one side of the debate and the rights that are harmed on the other side of the debate. Now, the moment you do this, this also allows you to say that you are in clash with the other team that speaks about rights. So you don't have to make it about utility versus a right. You can show in each world what rights are harmed or are benefited. So we're going to talk about several rights here that I think are interesting. So the first one, and obviously as everyone might have guessed, is privacy. So basically, when it comes to privacy, how is privacy harmed by different technology? Uh, so here, one might say that, as I explained, gathering information about us is something that companies as advertisers are required to do, and it's something that they can't really avoid. Now, here we can say that it harms our privacy because exactly it knows these things about us and can give this information to others. And what are the actual risks? So, what can those companies do to us when it comes to violating our privacy? So, we already assume that they know many things about us. And the first question is, can we trust them generally not to reveal this information to people that we don't want to know? So, one thing that they can do is simply reveal our secrets. There is information that people would have liked to keep secret from others due to the fact that they want to control their image in front of others, due to the fact that this is something that might harm them if others know about them, due to the fact that this is embarrassing potentially, and so on. But companies might reveal. So the most famous example for that is the teenager that got a letter from Walmart advertising different baby products, and her parents didn't know that she was pregnant, but Walmart did based on the searches that she did. And this is something that obviously got her in trouble or potentially could have. So there are many cases like this that information about us could be revealed to people that we don't want. And here, if we want to use a metaphor, a good metaphor could be just like outing people. I think that many people would say that outing someone, as in announcing that they belong to the LGBT spectrum, is something that we would consider immoral. You can say that this is the same thing with also revealing very intimate details about the lives of people. Now, this information can be given not only to advertisers, but it could also be given to different regimes that are somewhat authoritarian or could be seen as problematic. And here, this might have consequences that are already scary to the lives of people, because this is not only something that would sabotage their relationships with others, but could potentially have them punished by the state apparatus. And this is something that we as users can't really control, what is the government or whether the government has access to that information. Another factor that might misuse the information against us is our companies like Cambridge Analytica that want to reshape society, that want to create a societal cultural change and want to manipulate reality and want to manipulate us into doing things. And for that, they can use information about us to distort our perception of reality and make us vote one way or the other or think something about reality. Now, this is something that is not only problematic in the sense of it's a manipulation, it's bad, but you can connect this to the right of autonomy, because we usually say that the ability to make a decision that is autonomous is dependent on your ability to be informed and to be rational. Free, you're probably going to still be. And if you have wrong information, if you have fake news, if you have a distorted picture of reality, obviously your choices are not informed, because if you were informed, you would have made another decision. Therefore, it's something that takes away from your autonomy. Also, your decision is not rational if you are manipulated into being so emotional to the point where you can't see what your true objectives are as a person. And this is something that companies like Cambridge Analytica do. So here there are quite a lot of dangers from those corporations simply giving away our information. But also we can say that in a non-conspiracy, that doesn't have to be a conspiracy. We can say that the existence of the database is itself a danger, and that even though a company like Google might have the best intentions, there could be a government that would just override those intentions or would hack the database that they have, and then it would be a problem. We might also say that this is something that a country that is even democratic could do. If the police decides that this is information that might be relevant to crime solving and so on, and this is something that would eventually harm people. Just like we see with the objections that there are to biometrical databases and so on, which is another debate within itself. Now, if you want then to show why privacy matters so much, so I would go on to show why this could be the basis for me being an autonomous agent and for the decisions that I make. But also, there is importance to privacy in the sense of self fulfillment, that the only ability for me to be who I am is dependent on my ability to have different identities in different groups of people. And if I don't have control of that, or I don't have enough control of that, then this is something that ruins my life and therefore should be kept. And also that people need to have their own private sphere where they don't have to worry about this. And I think that the social platforms in a sense became this because many people start confiding with Google about things that are very intimate because they don't see that there might be another person sitting in front of their computer and getting access to this information. So, in that sense, this is something that we psychologically even can't avoid with giving our secrets to, because people need information, people need to consult with others, and so on. And here I would analyze, first of all, whether this right is harmed, but also I would ask the question of whether people conceded to this harm taken away from them. So whether they signed the I agree, really understanding that this is something that might happen, whether those companies could use this information without being detected, um, and so on. So this is something that I would definitely talk about. Also, notice that you would need to compare this in many debates to different, not only benefits, but rights that are uh, benefited from practices that harm privacy. So this might be balanced with the right for life. So many times when fighting terrorism, lives could be saved. So potentially you need to balance this with that. The right for personal security or personal health, the right to enjoy autonomy by having more information. So, for example, the reason I get to enjoy Google so much is because it has so much information that I can use. So, I can use the knowledge of others and the overriding of their privacy in order for me to become a much more fulfilled person and someone that makes better choices. The information is also a very useful tool for research, to understanding our society. We understand a lot of things that don't come up in polls, for example, because they come up on Google and so on. So these are things that we need to balance out with, and this is something that is up to you to show what we gain more on each side, or to show what is harmed more or less. So, what is the exact delta that the technology adds to a certain right, unlike the delta that it creates with another right? Also, you can try and question whether the right itself is a right. So there is this line of argumentation that says that privacy is not a right to begin with, that it's this new formation of a right which is pretty modern and did not exist in the world until certain technological and societal aspects, like having a house that is not shared with others, um, that allowed it to be a right. And maybe it's not as important for us people, and we can waiver this as a whole. And while it is nice for self actualization, it is not crucial for self-actualization. So that's on this right. I see that we don't have a lot of time to continue on with discussing the different rights that people have, but I would say that there are interesting aspects when it comes to the freedom of speech. There are many debates about freedom of speech and whether the cyberspace is an area that should be free of all restrictions, unlike the real world, or this is something that should follow the rules and maybe limit certain uh, speech. Also, there is the question of whether people abuse their right of speech in the social sphere, unlike other places, and maybe this means that we need to have a different set of rules. So, the fact that there is anonymity is something that allows people to misbehave online more. Also, there is the question here of whether there is a leakage, or at least there are blurred lines between the real world and the online sphere. And this is something that is evident in the reports of many victims of verbal abuse online. So people might say, well, look, it's just words, but we can see that there is evidence of people having strong emotional, physical reactions to being bullied online. And there is a question whether this entire separation of mind and body that is the basis of freedom of speech, because it says that you can't harm my body, but you can say whatever you want to me, is something that is less relevant when we talk about speech online and when we talk about speech in areas that are characterized by echo chambers and so on. So, a lot to talk about here, but do try and think about what makes the online world special when it comes to the freedom of speech, or what makes it just the same as the real world, and therefore it shouldn't be a consideration. Other rights that I just mentioned are the idea of human dignity and freedom. So, for example, if we talk about the archangel motion, there is the question of, are kids a different agent from their parents, and should they have their own bodily autonomy and dignity that is separated from their parents and not just see them as the property of their parents? There is also the question of the dignity of elderly that would be taken care by robots or by cameras that would record them, whether this is something that we can allow the overriding of just for the sake of taking care of them in a way that might be a bit better, and so on. Another issue is the idea of property rights. What is the meaning of property when it comes to online material that is not marketed in the same way as in the real world? What's the meaning of remixes? Is remix something that takes away from the right that I have from intellectual rights, and so on? Net neutrality is also an issue of property. Who pays for the internet, who pays for the traffic, should providers pay more for it, and so on. Another issue is ransomware. There was a debate in BBU about not allowing companies to pay ransomware to hackers, and there is the question of, do they have the right to their property in such a way that no one, including the state, can tell them not to pay ransoms, or there is a larger effect of deterring those hackers, even at the price of losing the property that I have on my computer to those hackers and losing access to it. So, really interesting stuff. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for it, but if you have more questions about that, feel free to ask. Last topic when it comes to rights. I won't talk about the internet as a right, but there is such a motion of whether the internet should be a right or not. I think it's very interesting. Once again, notice that rights here are used as a metaphor. So we need to see whether the internet actually answers the criteria of this metaphor as being a right or not. And there is the right of should we give rights to technology. These are issues like in the West world. So, should we give rights to artificial intelligence and so on? Uh, I think there are many aspects to it. There are many questions of what is life and so on. But I think the interesting aspect when it comes to technology is that this question actually overrides our understanding of the function of technology. So, is technology a tool for our means? And if this is a tool, does it mean that it doesn't have rights, or it means that it shouldn't be on the same level? There is the question of is this kind of technology able to reciprocate rights? So, does it have the capability to actually allow us to enjoy our rights or respect our rights as such? Um, and there is the idea of is it really human or is it just human like? And here there are researches that show that people tend to anthropomorphize technology, meaning that they tend to perceive technology that they see as an other being as a being, while it may not be such. So, if, for example, in the experiment they had a toy dinosaur and they were asked to smash it, most people could not because they thought that it's cute. And this has nothing to do with the fact that they know that this is not a real dinosaur, this is not an animal, this has no feelings and whatsoever. And the moment we understand this, that we have a lot of feelings towards technology, but it's not really based on the inherent features of the technology, maybe we would like to use this in order to show that technology does not have rights on its own, even though intuitively we might feel another way about it. Now, last thing about social impacts. So, this has to do with what I call macro effects. And often in debates, after we've analyzed what are the specific usages that each and every one of us can do with the technology, we might want to show broader impacts. And those impacts could be very relevant when we talk about things like banning a technology, or when we want to understand whether we prefer a world with the technology. And this is not just interpersonal relationships. So, for example, in a debate about 3D printing, we would want to talk about large economical macro effects of what it means to have a world where everyone can print whatever they want out of their own house and they don't need to go to a shop to buy it, or there would be less demands from factories for mass production of a certain thing if I can print this at home. What does this mean for manufacturing? What does this mean for artists? Does it mean that artists get to spread more of the blueprint of their idea, and they're less reliant on factories? Does this mean that their ideas could be stolen much more quickly, and so on? So, here, what I think people should look at is try to see what are the large effects. So, try and think about systems we know and what exactly is likely to change in those systems in the day after. And here I'd start with thinking either from what are the features of the new technology, or think about what are the features of systems, societal institutions that we know, and where could the technology impact them. Now, there are many cases where there were broad implications, and some of them we can predict, some we can't. I'm just going to give a few interesting examples of such changes that were not as easily predictable, but I think are very interesting to understand. So, the first one is about the use of Google in medical cases. So, here, the moment people saw Google as some as a tool that they can ask different questions to, people started gaining medical information from Google. And this is something that dramatically changed the way we talk to our doctors, the power relations that we have with a medical institution, and so on. And here you might want to try and analyze the different aspects of it and understand whether Dr. Google is actually something that helps us or not. So you can address issues such as, can people critically evaluate the information that they get online? Is the information online reliable, or is it just stories of people that are like you and me telling about their experiences of being sick, and this doesn't really reflect on whether someone else is sick or whether someone else would get the same responses from their doctors. We have the question of, would doctors be trusted if they say something that goes against Google? There is the question of, maybe this is good that patients have information and doctors can't patronize over them anymore, and so on. And what you want to do is you want to try and gather all of these small pieces of new interaction and new impacts of the technology and balance them out to show whether eventually this is a good or bad phenomena. Another interesting example is when it comes to house appliances and feminism. So, probably all of you know the analysis of why house appliances is something that really helps liberate women, and it is true, especially in places in the developing world. Things like the washing machine liberated women tremendously due to the fact that a very labor intensive, time consuming action that they had to do was solved and freed them to do a lot of important things. Actually, even today, some of the differences in time that boys and girls spend on hobbies such as computers is explained due to the fact that boys have to do less chores around the house. That's why they have more time to invest in things that are important for their future, unlike girls. So, in this aspect, home appliances did help a lot. But an unintended consequence of this is that home appliances did harm women from the bourgeoisie by the fact that they started doing uh, different chores, while in the past they had servants to do that. So actually, they lost some of the time that they had because now the responsibility of taking care of domestic issues moved to them because they didn't need a servant to do all of those actions that used to be very tiring and very complicated. Last example that I'm going to give is cars in the United States. A very interesting effect that cars had is their influence on uh, the suburbanization of America and different socioeconomical power relations between groups. The suburbs only emerged after the cars became a prominent factor, or at least the suburbs became a much larger phenomena, because the middle class could use a car to commute. And this allowed them not to live in city centers with other populations that they didn't like so much because of ethnicity, because of class, and so on, using this new technology that they had. This is also something that allowed many states not to develop public transportation enough because public transportation became the mainly used by lower background population, impoverished populations, meaning that these were populations that the state cared less about. So the state cared more about creating more roads for the middle class to commute and less on creating better buses for people to take if they live in the city. So this is an unintended consequence. I'm sure that no one that designed the car thought about such a thing, but this is interesting. So also try and think about, current existing power relations, different groups, and how they might use technology in different ways, and what this means about the relationship between those groups and between government and so on. This is also relevant to questions of equality and inequality between groups that you can analyze. Now, moving on to the last part of this lecture, which is regulation. So, as we said, government could be a huge player when it comes to technology, its development, its use, and so on. And government has a very important role of also protecting people. And here, the first thing that comes to mind is regulation when safety is concerned. And here, there are many cases where government did have to intervene in order to make sure that technology is safe enough. So, an example for that is radio. So, before the government intervened, everyone could use different radio frequencies, meaning that people could hear information that was secret in frequencies that were not meant for them but were meant for military or meant for different transportation, or people could disrupt the different broadcasting, therefore creating problems with communication in places that it was much needed. Therefore, the government had to regulate and had to intervene, but this is something that did take away from a lot of the power of different amateurs to use radio technology and so on. Another example is with autonomous cars. We might want to ask ourselves the question of whether governments should intervene and regulate this or not. On the other hand, we can say that the free market is enough in order to regulate technologies. So, an example for that is regulation with things that are concerning tampons. So, there is no state regulation, there is only an industrial regulation on the safety of tampons, and obviously, no company wants to have negative press about having tampons that are not safe. Therefore, you can say that it's enough of regulation. You can also say that when it comes to autonomous cars, the market itself could suffice, and you can explain what is the likely scenario if the market itself decides on moral algorithms of autonomous cars. Here, I think an interesting analysis is to explain why it is very likely that if the market regulates this, the algorithm is going to prioritize the driver always over everyone else that might be hurt, and you might want to use this as a basis of explanation of why this kind of selfish regulation is actually moral, really good, like the missing hand and so on. Or you might want to explain why this is selfish and this is something that is going to kill more more people. An interesting factor in this analysis is showing whether regulation could reduce or raise the number of users of the autonomous car, and you can show that if a certain regulation deters people from using those cars, this would be worse than any other consequence because those cars are generally safer. So you want people to buy them, and you would prefer even for the cars to be selfish as a whole. So that's about safety regulation. Now let's talk about monopolies and antitrust. So, how are technological monopolies created? There are three explanations. So, the first one is that it is inherent to the tech industry that monopolies are created. So, it's not some sort of conspiracy, it's not something that we do, it's something that happens because of the technology. And this has to do with economy of scale, meaning that in tech, the best company is likely to attract more people to it, or at least more people are likely to go with that technology. Now, those technologies become better by having more people in it. So, for example, Facebook can become much better if all of my friends are there rather than if some of them use other platforms and then I can't invite them all to my event or I can't publish it to them. Now, the moment that there are more people using my technology because it is better, it is becoming, once again, better than it used to be and better than the other competitors, meaning that this is a cycle where the good becomes better and then best, while others simply fade away and are less used by others. And this is important to understand because this is a very good basis for analyzing the monopolies and also analyzing the question of whether they are good or bad. The second reason for the creation of monopolies is the state. And here you can say that many times the state helps those companies by uh, being a tax haven for them, or by allowing them to earn so much that they can just buy the other competition, or they have so much money that no other company can compete with them or enter the market and provide a good enough product because they don't have enough of a capital in order to compete with them. Or you can say that the government does not do enough to prevent those monopolies. So the government does not intervene in the buying of other companies. The government does not limit the usage and so on. And here, just so you know, as a fact, it's good to know that Facebook also owns Instagram, its main competitor, and that Google also owns YouTube, making them huge powerhouses. Now, what does it mean that a company in tech is a monopoly? So this means that you can't live your daily life, or you almost can't live your daily life without using the products of that company. It becomes a part of your work, it becomes a part of your leisure time. It's something that you can't live without. So, for example, I don't think any of us can live without their Gmail account, or at least they become really reliant on it, or without YouTube, uh, and so on. And this means that there are no alternatives that I can use for the same function, whether those alternatives don't exist or because the price of moving to an alternative is too high. So, for example, I might lose all of the information that I gathered, I might lose all of my context, I might have to spend a lot of time adapting to this other technology and learning it. And this is something that I don't want to do because this is too costly for me. Now, what are then the risks of having such monopolies in technology? So, four risks. The first one is that this kind of dependency of people on the technology can be used by the corporation in order to harm him, or at least force him to do things that he did not want. So this is where issues of privacy can come to mind, that people are so reliant that they are willing or they are forced to let go of their privacy in order to continue on enjoying the service that they wanted, because no one would say, okay, you're changing the privacy settings, I would now leave you. Or at least it's very hard to say that. Or simply forcing a product that you don't want, like the case of Internet Explorer and Microsoft, that they just made you use this and you couldn't even delete it if you wanted. Or that annoying U2 album that Apple forced people to listen to if you had iTunes and you couldn't even avoid, so it would constantly play on your shuffle. Yes, it's me bickering about this. Also, this is something that harms not only one person but entire industries. For example, there is an interesting analysis of how journalism was hurt by changes in Facebook policy, because they started relying and they had certain revenues and certain expectations that they made based on a certain model of how Facebook would reward them. And the moment that this was taken away from them without even consulting, this is something that severely harmed their business, but consequentially harmed us as consumers of newspapers. So this was a problem. Or local small shops that advertise through Facebook, and how they might be hurt by the fact that they have no choice but to comply with this monopoly. Second danger of a monopoly is that those companies often hold critical infrastructures. So, for example, Amazon holds a lot of servers, or Google has a lot of underwater cables that are used to transfer online data that other companies are using as well. So not only Amazon use them, but they also lease them to other companies. And if those infrastructures are hurt, there is no backup to them. And this means that a lot of the population of the world would suffer if something happens to it, or if they are attacked in a cyber attack, and so on. And this creates a huge problem. for the entire world and its functioning. Third danger is that those companies use the dependency that there is in order to pressure governments to give them more benefits when it comes to taxes, and avoiding having to pay uh, their employers more, their employees more, and so on. And this is a problem, first of all, because this harms us, the taxpayers. This means that money that could have gone to other projects and things that we want as a society is now going to those companies, and they're not giving back enough to us. The second problem is that it doesn't allow other competitors to enter if the state is helping those big corporations so much, which leads me to the fourth uh, danger, which is that new players are limited in their ability to enter the market. And this is a problem because those actors might bring about more technology, more advancements, a different way of solving problems, and so on. And there is a question of whether these are mutually exclusive or not. Here, I think an interesting case to read about is actually the antitrust regulation that were forced on Microsoft. And there are many people that claim that the rise of Google was only possible due to those regulations on Microsoft and the fact that it had to pay so much. Also, it's interesting because Microsoft did not collapse after such a thing. So it does at least implicate that companies don't go bankrupt after there is regulation. Now, this does lead to the question of, so how is this regulation done? So I would start by saying that no one, and here I did some research, really knows what would be the regulatory infrastructure of the internet. So it doesn't mean that there are no ideas, but it means that it's quite unclear. And this means that in the debate, probably if you're government, you don't need to exactly define what would be the regulation, but just the general rules of it. And you can say that we would have government experts that would decide on the best specific ways of doing that. On opposition, you can try and say that generally this would not work and explain why or why it's not feasible. But don't try and obsess about the small details over this. But what could happen? So, first of all, is simply breaking the monopoly. So, something that happened with Standard Oil, for example, and Rockefeller, simply saying that the different functions that the company does are now different companies that need to be owned by different people. So, this is one option. Another one is not allowing companies to buy off smaller companies or new startups, or regulating this more. This can also be done not simply by banning, but by encouraging more capital investment in those startups for them to grow on their own and not just seek to be bought out by a different company, because right now it is a very good revenue for them and they cannot last as a small startup unless they are being bought, because they have no way of growing and developing a market of their own. Uh, Another thing is to notice that there are cultural differences in regulation. So you can say that there are areas in the world that care more about rights rather than the utility of it. So the EU is considered much more conservative than the United States when it comes to protecting certain rights of people. That's why there is the regulation of the right to be forgotten, which is a debate. There is now going to be a new privacy law that the EU passed that requires people to actively consent to giving information to certain aspects, and to be able to erase themselves in an easier way from different lists and different groups. The United States is more lenient when it comes to those things. An interesting idea about this is the idea of maybe having a Geneva Convention of the internet. And here, I think it's interesting, especially due to the whole Cambridge Analytica issue. So some of the ideas that they have, if you look for it, is not to share user information with others, as a general rule that everyone should abide to. The second one is not to allow any political posting, which is, I think, also a very interesting debate on its own, whether this is such a huge problem that maybe no one should post and have political posts, and more ideas that everyone should apply blindly as a blanket rule. If you want, there is a very interesting podcast on this from The Real Story by the BBC, where they lay down all of the ideas that they have for this. Now, I'm going to finish with the question of, okay, so who wants antitrust and who doesn't want antitrust? So, those who want antitrust are obviously competitors and other people in the market that want the market to be more free, want more people to get more chances to enter the technological sphere, and so on. Governments might also want that in order to not be extorted by those global corporations that become state like in their size and in their earnings. And some of the users might want regulation on issues of their privacy and so on. Who doesn't want antitrust? And here remember that it's not a one sided debate. So obviously the companies don't want that. But you can also say that many users would not want to have antitrust because this is something that is likely to harm the quality of the services that they get if this is not under one roof. And doesn't enjoy all of the resources and the ability to solve problems. And this might also lead to those new companies providing their services for money. So, if now the model is based on advertisement and the fact that people can enjoy for giving up their privacy things for free, probably if privacy becomes an issue, those companies might move on to a different model of collecting money. And this means that less people would enjoy it or would have to pay for it, meaning that it would become more exclusive and less inclusive in what people can do. And also, there are probably different actors that also enjoy status quo, also enjoy it politically, and so on. So, this was generally uh, the lecture about debating and technology. Obviously, there is much more to say. If you have questions, then feel free to type them or message me or simply meet me face to face without the use of technology to ask more. I hope this was helpful. I hope at least that this gave you some lines of thought. And that now you'd go on and research and find all of the cool motions that we've talked about and hopefully debate in a better way. So, thanks everyone.